Heart Lake. Those are like breezy trails, from what I remember. Like, these are like the most well-trodden trails in the whole High Peaks Wilderness, I guess. And just, as you get closer to the lodge, like it's just the trails are wider, there are fewer rocks, just easier to move quick. That's what I remember. And I made it down to Heart Lake at like 6:30. It was it was like, I forget, this is like Wednesday, right? So it's not like exactly prime time, but I remember feeling like it was popping. Like I passed a lot of people like hanging out at their campsites, and like, it's the end of the day, so people are leaving, but like I definitely got the sense of like there's like all this stuff, people cooking at their campfires. Yep. And like it was the closest to civilization I'd been in a couple of days at this point.
Yeah, I mean it's a good vibe around that time of day over at the lodge for sure.
Yeah, for sure. So I kind of skirted the lodge. I didn't want, I'm doing it unsupported, right? And I didn't want like the temptation of buying food or anything. So, I skirted the lodge over, on the southwest, going around the southwest side of Heart Lake, which I remember there's this it felt really cruel to me at the time. There's like a little ski hill, right? If you follow that trail, like, so coming down from the McIntyre Range and then turning left, like right before you get to Heart Lake. And then you kind of go up this like little ski hill around these shelters and then back down to the west side of Heart Lake. And I remember just like that little is probably like a 100-foot climb. Like just that like killed me.
Yeah.
So I was like, this is supposed to be flat. And yeah, so anyway, so I'm, and then from there over to Street and I, which there's like kind of a long approach. I was moving still moving pretty well. And then I kind of cruised up Street and I summited, let me see here, Street at 8:12 and then Nye at 8:30. And then I started heading down, and, the sun is basically, I just caught like the last end of the sunset around on Nye, from what I remember. And it's starting to get dark. And I'm descending the east. You're on the east side of the mountains, right? So it's like I'm in the shadows as I'm going down. And I turned my headlamp on probably like 2/3 of the way down Nye. And around like kind of right at the bottom, like right before you cross that creek back over into there's that stream crossing kind of right at the bottom where it's, and then from there it's like mostly flat over to Heart Lake.
Yep.
And right before I got to that stream crossing, I dropped and I was feeling pretty tired. So I just like took a 20-minute power nap. Just like, laid down in the dirt, put my rain jacket on to just try to keep some extra heat in, and lay down and nap for 20 minutes. And, I think I fell asleep like, instantly.
Sure.
But woke up, I felt better. Like my head was feeling pretty clear. It's probably like, 9:30 at this point. And, but I'm feeling like I'm having this feeling like, okay, it's dark. Like I've never done this. I've never been to the lodge. Like I'd never done this section of the High Peaks before. Unfamiliar terrain. It's dark. Everyone else is like nice and cozy by their campfires and their lean-tos and whatever. And it was definitely like a bit of a low point coming back to Heart Lake around like 10:30. And this is where I made my biggest mistake of the trip, where I decided the original plan is to kind of to complete the loop back to Lake Colden, which I would say is, kind of is pretty obvious and traditional, I think, for doing these, the unsupported FKT, to, complete the loop by going to tagging Phelps, Tabletop, and then Mount Colden.
Sure.
And then back to my base camp, which is what I originally planned to do. But I was pretty low at this point and cold and tired, because I didn't even bring that day I didn't even have like my puffy jacket with me. So I was, after like I woke up shivering from that dirt nap, and then, I got moving again, but like I was still cold, and I didn't want to, I'd never, Phelps, Tabletop, Colden, never done any of those summits before. And I was feeling uneasy about doing them in the dark for the first time. So I, in retrospect, I regret this, but I decided to just take the easy way back, to my base camp. So I kind of, cut off rather than going around the Mount Van trail, right, which goes up to Marcy and from which you can tag Phelps and Tabletop.
Yep.
I just went straight up like towards Avalanche Lake. And, which is still like a decent climb, but nothing, but no peaks. Right. And so I just followed that trail up Avalanche Lake, Lake Colden, and back to my campsite. Got back to that tent site at like just after midnight, around 12:30. And that's where I crashed. And I slept for about, I think, like 4 hours that night, which, felt short. It was late. This was the time, like I said, where I really felt like I was pressing into uncharted territory, right? Both literally in the sense that I'd never done, I'm familiar with this area of the High Peaks Wilderness, but then also the fact that it's my, second full day of like being on my feet, and it's dark. Like it was just, my mental power at that point was pretty low. So, I took the easy way back, and still managed to get a decent amount of sleep.
A decent amount of sleep, 4 hours of sleep, or maybe slightly less like that. I mean, at this point though, obviously, that is a decent amount of sleep, I suppose. And in the grand scheme of things, and what I've heard from people speaking to so many people about these sort of attempts, yeah, that's a good chunk of time. And I have had, I think on the last FKT episode I did, she mentioned that if she was to do it again, she would probably do like naps instead of night sleep. That would be her approach.
Yeah.
And then you can just more consistently take naps. But especially if you're not against climbing in the dark. But anyway, so yeah, that's another big day. But and at the end of doing Street and Nye, like obviously you intended, as you said, to do Phelps, Tabletop, and Colden, which is still like a big chunk of mountains. But even if you're not going to do that, and you still have to get back to Lake Colden, like even at the end of Nye, you still have a long way to go. Even though it's like flatter-ish, even though it's not necessarily flat, but even if you're not intending to hit those mountains at that hour and it's dark and you're tired and you're cold, like you still had a long way to go, but ultimately you made it, which is good. And then you got about 4 hours of sleep, which would set you up for day 3, which was the biggest day of the hike in terms of elevation gain. And we're going to break things up right there. So far, we've heard day 1 and day 2 of Matt Mochella's FKT, unsupported, that is, of the 46 High Peaks, and as well as the prep, what he did to prepare his gear, his food breakdown, and everything along those lines. So since there's so much to talk about, and since I try to keep every podcast summit session to an hour, I'm actually going to break this episode up into 2 parts. So tune back in next week to hear day 3, 4, and 5 of Matt's unbelievable FKT. Thanks to everyone for listening to this week's summit session right here on the 46 of 46 podcast. And make sure you listen next week for part 2 of Matt Mochella's unsupported FKT of the 46 High Peaks. You are in for a doozy of a story next week. Remember to always leave no trace, do the rock walk, and if you carry it in, carry it out. See you on the trails, everybody, and see you next week.